The scream came from somewhere deep inside Laura before she even understood what she was seeing. It tore out of her throat, raw and jagged, shredding the quiet of the forest on the outskirts of Port Charles. A moment earlier, the woods had been nothing more than a dark tangle of trunks and shadows, the kind of place that made the imagination misbehave but still felt, on some level, like ordinary nature. In the cold second before her mind caught up, she had been a mayor, a mother, a woman who had survived more than most. The instant after, she was something else entirely, someone standing on the edge of a nightmare, staring at something that should not exist, something that twisted her features into pure horror as the camera cut away and left the audience with nothing but the echo of that scream. Hours before that moment, the city had looked almost normal. The lights of Port Charles glittered off the water, hospital windows glowed like tired, watchful eyes, and the hum of ordinary crises carried on in distant sirens and murmured arguments. But beneath that surface, Laura had already felt it, the sense that something was sliding off its axis. A series of small incidents had begun to line up in her mind like beads on a string. A missing hiker reported just beyond the city limits, an abandoned car discovered near an old maintenance road, strange interference on the police scanners that never seemed to trace back to a source. None of it, on paper, demanded the mayor's personal attention. Yet it gnawed at her. Port Charles had a way of pretending that horror only lived in its history, in the stories everyone already knew. Laura understood better than anyone that the past didn't stay buried, it resurfaced, chose new shapes, and came back when everyone was most tired and least prepared. In City Hall, she'd tried to treat the unease as just that, unease. She focused on policy papers and budget meetings, listened to advisors talk about infrastructure repairs and campaign positioning, nodded at the right moments. But her thoughts kept drifting to the outskirts, to the patch of land beyond the industrial district where the streetlights simply stopped and the world turned black and silent. It was supposed to be nothing more than forest. A buffer between the town and whatever lay beyond the county line. Yet lately it had started to feel like a boundary between the life she was trying desperately to hold together and something darker pressing in from the edges. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw a stand of trees framed in her headlights, wet earth, and the impression of something just out of sight. The call that finally pulled her away from her desk came at dusk, just as the sky over Port Charles sank from bruised purple into full night. It wasn't from an officer or a staff member, but from a voice she couldn't quite place, distorted, breathless, as if the caller were hiding in a closet or pressed against a wall trying not to be heard. The message was simple and chilling, out by the old service road. You missed something. They hid it where you'd never look. If you want the truth about what's happening to your town, go now, before someone else gets there first. Then the line went dead. No name, no number that could be traced. Just a low, whispering urgency that sank into her bones. Logic, experience, and every self-preserving instinct Laura possessed told her to turn this over to the police, to Dante or Jordan, to anyone whose job it was to chase ghosts through dark trees. But the words "you missed something" struck a different nerve. They wrapped around her guilt, her sense of responsibility for every life lived under her watch, for every shadow cast by decisions made in her office or in the murk of backroom deals she hadn't known were happening. Port Charles had paid dearly, time and again, for secrets. She had promised herself there would be no more blind spots, no more shrugging off the feeling that something was wrong simply because there was no neat line item on a report to justify it. So she made a choice. She did send a message to Dante, leaving a brief, coded update that something had come in about the outskirts and that they might have missed evidence related to the recent strange activity. She told him to meet her near the old service road if he could. But she didn't wait for him. She couldn't. The sky was closing in, and the voice from the phone, the sense of something moving faster than official channels could respond, refused to let her sit still. She grabbed her coat, ignored the concerned look from an aide who tried to ask where she was going, and walked out into the gathering dark as if it were something she knew how to tame. The drive out of town peeled away the illusion of safety with every mile. Street signs grew sparse, houses thinned, and the hum of the city faded behind her until only the low drone of the engine and the pounding of her own heart kept her company. Her headlights sliced through the darkness in narrow beams, catching glimpses of overgrown weeds, rusted fences, and the occasional glint of far-off industrial metal. The forest on the outskirts didn't appear all at once. It crept up, first as a line of trees in the distance, then as a wall of dense trunks pressing closer to the road, branches knitting overhead like fingers trying to hide whatever lay within. By the time Laura turned onto the old service road, the pavement had narrowed to a rough, cracked strip carved between looming trees. It was the kind of place people avoided unless they had a reason to be there. Teenagers looking for somewhere to drink, workers cutting through to save a few minutes, or someone with something to hide. The GPS didn't recognize the turn, and cell reception flickered into nothing. She parked where the road simply faded into hard-packed dirt, killed the engine, and sat in the sudden silence, letting her eyes adjust. The stillness was the first thing that struck her. No crickets. No distant traffic. Just the faint rustle of leaves and the steady, oppressive beat of her own pulse in her ears. Laura stepped out, the cold night air hitting her like a warning. Every instinct screamed at her that this was reckless, that even after everything she had survived, it was still possible to push her luck one step too far. But she pushed forward, switching on a small flashlight she kept in her bag. The narrow beam trembled slightly as she pointed it toward the trees. Each trunk she illuminated looked like a sentry, tall and silent, guarding secrets buried in the undergrowth. There were faint impressions of tire tracks in the dirt, barely visible but fresh enough that recent rain hadn't erased them. Footprints overlapped, some deep and heavy, others shorter, lighter, more erratic. People had been coming and going here, and recently. As she moved deeper into the woods, memories rose uninvited, the countless times she had walked into danger for this town, the losses that had followed. Faces of those she couldn't save flickered at the edges of her mind, blending with the shadows between the trees. She remembered standing in other hidden places, staring down at other things that had shattered families and rewritten lives. Port Charles had seen bodies dragged from water, secrets clawed out of shallow graves, truths exposed in the harsh light of day. But this felt different, like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for her to catch up to something that had been here longer than the latest crisis, longer than any election, longer even than the scars on her own history. Something caught her eye, a scrap of fabric snagged on a low branch, fluttering faintly in the night breeze. She moved closer and saw that it wasn't just random trash. The pattern was familiar, the kind of print you might see on a jacket or scarf someone wore every day. A few feet beyond, the ground looked disturbed, leaves kicked aside, a faint drag mark cutting through damp earth and vanishing into deeper darkness. Her stomach tightened. This wasn't a place where someone had simply gotten lost. This was a place where someone had been moved. Or taken. The deeper she went, the more the world narrowed to the circle of light from her flashlight and the crunch of twigs under her boots. At one point she heard a crack behind her, spun, and saw nothing but trees and shadows. The fear that crept up her spine wasn't just for herself. It was for whoever had been brought out here, for the possibility that she was already too late. Questions raced through her mind. Was this connected to the missing hiker? To the abandoned car? To something older, something that tied into schemes she hadn't fully uncovered yet? Was this the work of a single predator, or was she about to step into the physical evidence of a wider conspiracy that had quietly been growing in the blind spots of her administration? It was the smell that reached her first, subtle at the edge of perception, then impossible to ignore. Damp earth, rotting leaves, and beneath it all a sour tang of something else, something that made her throat tighten and her instincts scream at her to turn back. She swallowed against the rising nausea and pushed forward, moving slower now, the beam of her flashlight trembling more visibly as she swept it across the forest floor. Her breath had grown shallow, each inhale a careful negotiation between the need for air and the dread of what that air carried with it. The trees thinned just enough to reveal a small clearing, a pocket of space where moonlight managed to pierce the canopy and pool in a cold, silvery sheen. The ground here looked wrong. The leaves weren't lying naturally, they had been disturbed too recently to have settled back into place. The soil showed signs of being roughly turned, then hastily covered. And at the far edge of the clearing, half buried in the dirt, something pale caught the light. For a split second, Laura's mind refused to identify it. It could have been a rock, a piece of cloth, anything but what her instincts told her it was. She took a few steps closer, each one heavier than the last, her heart hammering. When the full shape came into view, time seemed to fragment. The world contracted around the sight at her feet, around the terrible certainty crashing through her. It might have been a hand, fingers rigid and unnatural where they jutted out from beneath disturbed earth. It might have been a flash of a familiar face caught in the harsh, unforgiving light of her flashlight, eyes staring without seeing. It might have been something stranger, something that didn't belong in any rational explanation of this night. The audience wouldn't know, not yet. All they would see was Laura's reaction, the way her body recoiled, the way her shoulders locked, the way the carefully controlled composure of a seasoned survivor crumbled in an instant. Her scream ripped through the clearing, shattering the suffocating quiet. It wasn't dignified or restrained, it wasn't the measured reaction of a politician used to cameras and press conferences. It was primal, the sound of someone who had found the reality they feared most and had no time to prepare for it. That scream told a story even the camera didn't need to show. It told of recognition, of horror too specific to be abstract. It told viewers that whatever she was seeing wasn't just terrible, it was personal. Something, or someone, in that clearing connected directly to the fragile web of relationships and responsibilities she'd been trying to hold together. The scene held for a heartbeat, framed by the wild arcs of her flashlight and the trembling of her silhouette against the trees. Leaves rustled as if recoiling from the sound. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, the only witness to a nightmare unfolding in the dark. The shot tightened on Laura's face, capturing wide, disbelieving eyes and the silent tear that broke loose and cut a path down her cheek even as her mouth hung open in shock. It was the image of a woman who had already survived more than her share of trauma, now confronted with a new horror that might eclipse them all. And then, just as the audience leaned forward, desperate to see what had triggered that reaction, the screen cut to black. The echo of her scream lingered over the network's logo, over the promise that answers would have to wait. Had Laura discovered a lifeless body buried just beyond the edge of town? Had she stumbled onto evidence of a new threat, one that had been quietly hunting in the shadows of Port Charles while everyone else focused on more visible dangers? Was this connected to familiar enemies or the first glimpse of something terrifyingly new? The questions hung in the air, as relentless and heavy as the night pressing in on that clearing. In that final pre-ad moment, Laura wasn't just a character in a hospital drama anymore, she became the beating heart of a horror story unfolding on the town's doorstep. The forest, once a simple backdrop, had been transformed into a crime scene, a graveyard, or a gateway into a secret that could tear Port Charles apart. The last thing viewers saw before the commercial break wasn't the answer, but the promise that when the truth finally emerged from the shadows, it would change everything, and that Laura, whether she was ready or not, would be the one standing at the center of it.